Hi, I'm Dick Vermeil. I've seen a lot of good arms over the years, but Frank here has a really good arm. So does Carla. Louisa's got a great arm. Marcus, too. Everyone in our region has a great arm, capable of defeating COVID-19. So get your vaccination when you can. They're safe and effective. It's been a challenging year with times of anxiety and loneliness. Together, we can make this the greatest comeback win in Philadelphia history. We'll beat COVID-19.
Back to school has taken on new meaning in 2021. COVID-19 has been tough on the mental health of teens. A recent report by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that during the pandemic, 1 in 4 high school students reported worsened emotional and cognitive health. Teens of color, especially Asian American youth, are suffering greater impacts. Around 7 in 10 LGBTQ teenagers reported symptoms of anxiety and depression. And substance use disorders and overdoses among adolescents have increased during the pandemic. Today on Inquirer Live, we talk with Dr. Frances Jensen about the developing brain. Jensen is the chair of neurology at Penn's Perelman School of Medicine, and she'll tell us how science can help families navigate this time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm so pleased today to have a very special guest on our program, Dr. Frances Jensen, the chair of the Department of Neurology at Penn's Perelman School of Medicine. You all don't need me to tell you that we are living through extraordinary times. And whether you are a child, an adolescent, a parent, a grandparent, just someone who loves children, like me, you've probably spent a good amount of time thinking, how on earth are we going to get our kids through this in a happy and whole and prepare them for the next stage of their lives? The good news is here that science, just like it was here to help us with the vaccines, is also here to help us with the emotional end of the pandemic. Now, I know that you'll all have a lot of questions, and depending on which venue you're watching us on, you will need to go to our website in order to post your questions. We won't be able to post them on Facebook or Twitter. The site to go to is inquirer.com/healthreportlive, and we'll be happy to take your questions there. So now I'd like to welcome Frances Jensen to the stage.
It's great to be here.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jensen. I know that introductory video was kind of a downer. The data are not super happy, but one of the things that I enjoyed most about your book, The Teenage Brain, and the work that you have done for years, not only at Penn, but also at Harvard, is that you have an unfailingly optimistic view of the resilience of kids and adolescents. So I just want to start out by assuring everyone that we are not going to bum them out. This is actually a pretty uplifting kind of message that you have.
That's right. And it's a new message, actually, because the science, neuroscience, meaning the study of the brain and mind, is a relatively newcomer on the field of biomedical sciences and has just been having an explosion in the last 10 to 20 years. Information about the adolescent brain is very new. And in fact, the current generation of adolescents is the first that can benefit from the new knowledge about the adolescent brain, which speaks to the science behind their unique strengths and their unique weaknesses. And we're seeing both come up as a result of this very challenging last year and a half. So I'm here to help explain some of the basic differences between teenagers and children and adults, and why this is a window of opportunity, but also one of vulnerability, and where we should use the science to protect our young.
Right. So right now we've all seen a lot of people who are very worried about issues like vaccination and mask wearing and testing. Are those really the places where parents and families should be putting their greatest concern? Or you and I have discussed the fact that we both have grown children. If your boys weren't yet as old as they are now, if they were still going back to school, where would you be putting your energies as both a neuroscientist and a parent?
Yeah, I would be putting my energies in trying to support their social development, because this is a window of intense social development. So how they interact with peers, how they identify themselves, how they're beginning to understand who they're going to become and express that. But I'd also be concerned about isolation, social isolation, overexposure to the internet and social media and passive media, lack of routine. And I'd also be concerned about how they're being educated. What I'd like to go on to explain is why this is a wonderful window for education, and their brains are able to learn faster than they ever will again in adulthood. So I'd want to make sure that we're really getting enough out of the education system, and that I'm watching my children as they go through this unusual year of education, and making sure that at least they're getting the adequate amount of foundational knowledge for their age.
Well, do you think that kids can bounce back from, well, some people have called it education losses. I know that that's a pretty controversial term. Can our kids bounce back from that? What happens if the pandemic gets really bad again and they're back on remote school?
Yeah, so the brain is developing, by the month, by the day, by the week in this window. And, it is the most complex organ in the body. It takes the longest to develop. So our brains are not really fully adult-like probably until your mid to late 20s. Okay. So this is a window that they're passing through. During this window, children and adolescents are being shaped by the environment. The brain is what we call plastic. It's the more you use certain circuits because of good and bad exposures, the stronger they get. And so you can imagine how you can really, affect brain development in this window, whereas while the brain is still growing. And it grows from the back of the brain to the front. So the last place to connect is the frontal lobe, which for those of you that have not reviewed brain anatomy recently, the frontal lobe is basically what makes us very human. It is our seat of executive function, impulse control, judgment, empathy, organizational skills, decision-making, all those good things. And then back behind that frontal lobe are more basic functions of the brain, including social and emotional, sexual, control is sort of in what we call the limbic system. And so the brain is developing from the back to the front, both its connections from one place to another, but also the actual brain cells themselves and how they're connecting inside the regions. It's going from the back to the front. So by teenage years, the basic elements of building blocks of brain function, like motor and visual and sensory systems, are pretty intact, but the social brain is building at that point. And the executive function comes on late in teen years and into the first few years of adulthood. So you can see that we have, during development, the adolescent is running on their social brain. It's the part that's connected, but there isn't a frontal lobe to say, wait, bad idea, don't do that. Your peer pressure rules in that window, because it is the time of development that you're working on your social connections and how you're going to interface with people. This is what's happening in those brains. So that peer pressure is the ultimate stimulus to them. And they don't have, like adults, the ability to override and say, if I think about the cause and effect of this, this is not such a good idea to do this just because I'm being egged on. So this is the beginning of how people who work with teenagers, parents themselves, can start to take a step back and look at what their teenagers actually do on a day-to-day basis. They take risks. Check. That's normal. That's what the brain is supposed to be doing. The frontal lobes are not fully there. They're very, very potentially, relative to adults, more guided by social pressures than adults. And I think that, if you step back as a parent and stop when you get frustrated by a teenager doing these things, taking risks when they really shouldn't, in your mind, they don't have the equipment on board yet to really make that decision that you are holding them accountable for. So I find that for parents, it's a little bit relieving in a sense for them to go, all right, this is biology playing itself out. I want to guide my teen into a safe space, but I have to realize that they aren't an adult with fewer miles on them. And what I'll say, and probably say again, and it's a good statement to make at the beginning of this, is that last I checked, adults, all of us around teenagers, have our frontal lobes on board, attached, and we should be giving them a frontal lobe assist from time to time in terms of decision-making, planning, thinking ahead, predicting, and, overseeing. And you have to stay connected.
Yeah. I was struck, your book, The Teenage Brain. I should tell people, I am not a neuroscientist. I am a humble journalist, but I still found this book very readable and understandable. And what made you decide to write it? Because it's a pretty unconventional book for the chair of neurology to write this book that is very practical, and it's got lots of advice I wish I had when our girls were younger.
So I was, this is what I was back in Boston. I was doing, I'm a neurologist and neuroscientist. So I study the developing brain and also the aging brain, but the developing brain was a big focus at that point. So in my own lab, I was studying how the brain is developing, how the connections are being made over the lifespan. And there I realized that I also had an experiment going on in my own home, my two teenage sons. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to understand why these were bright kids, but making some questionable choices, let's just say, getting into, there were all sorts of events, everybody on this, many of the parents, I'm sure, are rolling their eyes. And I'm like, all right, this was in the late 2000s, like 2010, 12. And the science was just coming out. So we were doing research in the lab, but also all this great science was coming out from, as I said, neuroscience is a late breaking field. So our ability to image the brain, do genetics, things like that were really very new. And the results were coming out. So I thought, that's it. I'm going to figure out what's going on with my kids. And it started off with doing like Teen Brain 101 talks around the Boston area, initially in the Science Museum. And then one thing led to another. And somebody asked me to write a book because the information, I was trying to translate basic science that's usually locked up in the ivory towers of, medical centers and researchers when people need it. It's relevant to our lives. And I think it was well received because of that. And there's all sorts of really great information about, we can talk about many of these things, about their ability to learn better than adults. What's the biology of that? Why do they respond to stress differently? Why are their sleep patterns different? Why do they get addicted faster, longer, stronger than adults? All these things. And, and why do they have these sort of, to adults, some maddening behavior patterns, because they are driven by different parts of their brain are running them compared to adults. And we have to appreciate that rather than hold them, even our legal system will hold them accountable to adult guidelines when it's really not right. It's not the same. They don't have the same equipment.
Right. But this, as you make clear in your book, this is not to say that they should be allowed to do whatever crazy thing they do. Where and how do you draw that line that says no, you do not get to excuse your behavior on your lack of a frontal lobe?
Exactly. And this is where knowledge is power. I mean, as adults, we can remind them we actually know what's going on now with their brains, and it's not an excuse, but we have to be a little bit more empathetic. And as I said, sort of this idea of a frontal lobe assist, recognizing that they do not read between the lines. It's just not there yet. You have to be much more explicit with a teenager. They're not going to infer because you give them a couple of, concepts that they're not going to be able to necessarily operationalize those things. And I think you have to be much more explicit with a teenager about why they have the behavior they do, how to prevent being in a risky situation with a bad consequence. And I think parents are very well suited, as are teachers and community leaders, to work with teenagers. But also it's a message that needs to be delivered with a positive tone, not oh, you're inadequate. They are exactly what they should be at this window of their development. No more, no less, maybe more, but definitely we can't hold them to a difference to the standard of being adults with fewer miles on them. So I try to message that and hope that parents will also look at some of the opportunities that we, without this recent knowledge, would have overlooked. For instance, the fact that brain cells, when you're learning, make connections. And the more you use the brain cells in a task, like you're learning something, you are strengthening those connections. And that's what learning and memory is. All the molecules for that to create stronger connections are set at higher levels in the teen brain than the adult. So they can learn by osmosis, not quite as well as a child that can learn languages flawlessly, seamlessly within, 2 and 3 languages in very quickly, but they are much better than adults. And it's this, we call this synaptic plasticity, and they have the ability to do this faster. So what I think in terms of for education, that this is the window to be educated in your, you've got the best ability to learn, and you're building on the more, not the basic parts of your brain, because they're developed. Now you're building more eloquent parts of your brain, decision-making, social, emotional intelligence, are all things that are being constructed in the teen years. And I think we have to realize that there is a resilience. If there's a weakness, this is the time to focus on it and get some remedial, if you will, but really work on that weakness, because you'll never get the bang for your buck that you will get in your teen years later in adulthood if you try to correct, a difficulty with math or language or reading or writing. And also, if we spend a little time trying to figure out what our teenagers' strengths and weaknesses are, meaning their strengths, like hidden talents that they may have, this is the time to deep dive into them, their musical, athletic, writing, artistic talents. This is the time where they can really create a foundation that will serve them later in life. And now we understand the biology of it. It is real. It is sort of like carpe diem, capture this time window. And I hope that, many school systems are understanding this better now. And I think it's important for parents to understand this isn't just sort of a throwaway time period that you just make it through. And because of that, it does matter that you learn certain things early, mid, and late teen years, like childhood, and in orderly fashion. So can you go back, and if you lose a year, yes, they are much more able to capture a lost year, if you will, than an adult would. So this is a window, although we don't like to see that happen. And I think we've learned a lot through COVID, the education system, that simply just shutting down is not the right way. And one must press on and offer education in one way or another, because the brain is developing day by day and needs that guidance by education.
Yeah. So I want to shift a little bit to a subject that has been a big deal for back to school long before COVID, and that is school start times. Can you talk a little bit about adolescent sleeping behavior and why it is that they're not just staying up late and sleeping late to drive you crazy?
Right. So their sleep cycle is different from ours. And interestingly, a lot of other mammalian species, animals, go through this window in their version of adolescence, which is that their clock is shifted late. And in what happens to us is we have melatonin, like the stuff you can buy at CVS. We have a part of our brain that releases that into our brain, calms us down, and makes us go to sleep. That's happening in mid-evening, 8:30-ish, 9 in adults. And about an hour and a half later, you are feeling like you need to go to sleep. Teenagers' brains are wired such they do not release it until 11 or 12 at night. So, they are pushed back, and then they sleep late to capture the 9 to 10 hours that they need and should have. So we've been treating the teenage brain and childhood brain for that matter, but mostly teenagers, because children will go to sleep early and wake up early. Teenagers do not. And we've been waking them up at 6:30 or 7 to go to school, which is equivalent to waking an adult up at 3:30 in the morning, right? And would you like to have to, show up and take your SATs at that time in the morning? You would not be on your best behavior. And it turns out that learning is impaired by sleep deprivation at any age, but teenagers are very vulnerable to that. So they're not that plasticity I'm talking about, those molecules that cause, these connections to really strengthen. They go down when you're sleep deprived. So then they kind of struggle. They're unable to really create those connections as well. So plus, we know that when you do test taking, teenagers do not as well in the mid-morning. Most teenagers, there's always exceptions, but most teenagers do much better around midday or early afternoon when they take a test than early in the morning, for this reason, that they're finally waking up. So many schools have actually listened to this information and tend to start the school day later. If they can't, for logistical reasons, start the school day later because parents have to go to work and buses come by and pick the kids up, the idea would be to do something less rigorous early, like meditation, which is good for your brain. We can talk about that. Or exercise, which is also good for learning. We can talk about that, rather than push them straight into like heavy duty, test taking. So I think that we've learned a lot about this. And when you look at your teenager, you have to realize they need a high level of sleep. And that's another burden that COVID has, brought upon us, is that people are anxious. They're not sleeping as well. Teenagers are also highly stimulated by social media. So guess what they're doing in the evening? They're on social media till 1 or 2 in the morning. And it turns out that the blue light on your screen actually suppresses melatonin. So they've got they're stacking the cards against them. Their melatonin doesn't come out. They're suppressing it by the blue light, and they're overstimulated by lots of social media. So to tell your teenager to sort of back off on the social media, go into some quiet time, like around 10 or 11 at night, to see, help them get to sleep at a more reasonable hour, certainly if they have to wake up for that 6:30, alarm clock.
Okay, well, but how do you do that? I mean, I've got somebody here asking a question. Am I ruining my teenager by letting them spend so much time on video games or online? I mean, I'm sure you have tried to take away a phone from a teenager who is clutching
Right.
it like it's their lifeline. I mean, how do you do that? That's really hard.
It is. And, let me just say that a part of this, and I'm not trying to be like ridiculously idealistic, and I was a parent too, but teenagers are fascinated with themselves, if you haven't noticed. It is a time of deep self-absorption, and it should be, because they are trying to figure out their identity. We just talked about that. They're trying to work out, who are they going to be as an adult? How do they interact? What are they known for? They're very interested in themselves. You start telling them information about their brain and why they do the things they do, they become very interested. I've spoken to many, 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 many groups of high school students over the years. And I've had overwhelmingly comments like, oh, thank you for this lecture. Now I know why I did that ridiculous thing on Saturday night. I couldn't figure it out. And I didn't know whether that was me or, now I know it's my brain, but I feel like I'm beginning to understand myself. So again, by sharing this information with them, they are thirsty for information, but you have to make it relevant. And as a frontal lobe assist, you have to say, less sleep, worse learning. You're going to put in many more hours in front of those books and get half the bang out of it than if you were well rested. So here's some ideas about getting more sleep to help you make your life easier. You have to kind of make it relevant at the same time as, about them, and it's appropriate, and they're fascinated.
Well, they are fascinating. I can totally see that. And as you're talking to kids, are a lot of them surprised to hear that they should be getting 9 or 10 hours of sleep a night?
Not really. They all know they probably should be getting 9 or 10. They know they don't feel good. And let's just remember that sleep, another function sleep has across our age span, it's a time when we consolidate memory in our deep sleep. And so when you have that deep, deep sleep, which you only have, 1 to 2 hours of through the course of a night, your memories are being consolidated from the day before. So, for instance, if you study something that you really have to nail down, studies have shown it's better to do that right before you sleep than compared to the same amount of memorization that would happen, say, in the middle of the day, where you go on to many other things and kind of it doesn't settle in. So again, explaining that to them, how important that is, I think is helpful. They are data driven. That's the one thing about this generation, is they are immensely data driven. And I think they have an appetite for science that maybe their parents are not, maybe don't see. But in general, this is a very data driven generation.
Interesting. And talking about sleep and not getting enough of it brings us to a topic here that was on my list, and also I'm getting questions here from our viewers. Are teenagers more prone to depression and anxiety? Let's talk about that, which I'm sure there's quite a connection with sleep as well as brain development.
Yes. Okay. So a really important thing about brain development is that, as I said, you are developing these more eloquent areas of your brain later. This is what's happening in your late teens and early 20s. Turns out those parts of the brain are the ones that are engaged in affective psychiatric disorders like bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, these kinds of disorders. And it is not a coincidence that they come on in mid to late teens. Suicidality is at its highest in right around early 20s. And it is not a coincidence that these diseases first manifest themselves. The brain parts have to be connected enough to manifest those diseases. And it turns out about 75% of people with major affective disorders, now this is major affective disorders, bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, psychosis, have their onset between 16 and 26 years of age. So this is kind of epidemic in this window, and we don't do a very good job, I think, of screening people for this. And there's biology behind why, it's happening in that window. It is also rather ironically the window in which your peers are probably the least sympathetic to you. And so they can be shunned. They are not necessarily, and where you may not have the communication skills yet to talk about it with an adult. So another important thing for adults around teenagers, if you see extreme behavior in your teenager, being disheveled, loss of appetite, withdrawn, it may not just be they're having a bad day. It may bear a little bit more watchful eye on the part of the parent and even the school to make sure this is not maybe the first signs of this. Now, those are the major disorders, and we know that they are absolutely developmental and they come on in this window. And the good news is, if you intervene in this window, you have a much better opportunity to reverse or cause a much more stable long-term outcome for that person with depression or schizophrenia if you intervene in this window. So it's really important because of the plasticity that I talked about. You can kind of help the brain a bit rewire itself if you give the right medications and the right cognitive behavioral therapy as early as possible. And that's what, is being pushed a lot now by mental health experts to sort of nail it early. Now, anxiety and milder depression are absolutely epidemic. There are college surveys that have shown this is like off the roof right now. And we know that that this is a window for anxiety. And it is because, of course, if you think about it, the social brain is really king and they are very dependent upon how they believe they're being perceived by others. We are very concerned with COVID in that the numbers have gone up significantly because of a lot of things that have been shown to worsen outcome, like lack of routine, females more than males, the adolescent window, of course. It turns out that excess isolation and exposure to social media and the passive internet, it's called, increases your risk of anxiety and depression because you're just withdrawing from reality. And also, of course, prior mental health issues in the family. A lot of mental health disorders are inherited. The brain is the most complex organ and is sort of organized by many, many genes. And that's why we see, a really high inheritance rate for mental illness, addiction, substance abuse. These are all, they often have a genetic component. So again, if somebody has a family history, one needs to have a little bit even more watchful eye during this window. And I, have spoken up with Health and Human Services about how we need to, I think, develop a better screening program in our society in general for this window. And I think, colleges are getting really good at rolling out programs and screening programs for people because of course this is the window it hits. It's not that the college is this hostile environment. It's just that's where they are in that window.
Yeah. Well, we've been writing stories at the Inquirer lately about the incredible dearth of resources for mental health, especially for children. The most seriously troubled kids, we've had reports of them spending days and days and days waiting for a possible placement. But even on the less serious scale, how is a parent to get their child screening that would reveal that something needs to be done? Because gosh, we've all heard tragic stories of something terrible happening and the poor parent thinking, I thought they were okay. It seemed okay.
Yeah, I think pediatricians. So again, this is relatively, we always have seen this, developmental kind of pattern as to when these diseases came on. But I think there are things in society right now that are mitigating higher rates of certainly anxiety and depression. But pediatricians have it's really only in the last 10, 12 years that this information has really been available, that this is the time, the window this comes on, you need to be vigilant. It is getting better. There are screening questions that are asked now by most pediatricians. So pediatrician is your first stop. And then the next stop will be if there's a school, the kid is at school or, still in school, that talking to the school, whether there's counseling there. I would say that we've learned a lot in COVID in many areas of medicine, but I think the one area of medicine that has adapted unbelievably well is psychiatry to COVID, in that what you and I are doing right now, this interface over video, can be a perfectly adequate psychiatric assessment tool. And you don't have to show up in person. So care is now more able to be delivered. The health insurers and the systems are all now more accepting of telemedicine and telepsychiatry and teletherapy. And so I feel hopeful that we've entered a new phase, thanks to COVID, in making psychiatric care more available. It's not perfect yet, and I think we're realizing. I always have said, and I've always say that the brain and neuroscience it's the center of healthcare reform. At the end of the day, what are we trying to preserve? It is the brain and your mental health and your ability to have quality of life. So I think we've overlooked some parts of psychiatry and neurology in the last century, simply because nobody understood how they worked. It was a black box system. Now we have tools. We have things like magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, as many of you probably have heard of that term, something called functional MRI, which is, it looks at, somebody can be doing a task, they can be in the scanner and they will be asked to read or speak or use a hand. And the part of their brain that is controlling that will light up. It's actually showing it's increasing blood flow. That's what is being measured. This has been hugely important in watching how brains develop and how how brains connect to themselves, like how meditation works. Lots of things have been learned about only in this last decade, really, conclusively, more conclusively than before. So I'm very optimistic. We're all going to have much more neuropsychiatry available to us. And now we're understanding how the brain we're beginning to understand how the brain works. So we're offering therapies that we didn't have either.
Yeah. And then also I'm making neural connections here. A few minutes ago, you were talking about how data-driven teenagers are. I've been really struck with the young people I know. They want to talk about their mental health issues.
Yes.
I mean, when I was a kid, like I'm not going to speak for you, but I mean, nobody talked about it. This was like
There was a stigma.
nobody was depressed.
Mhm.
Everything's fine. Just
Yeah.
cheer up. And so that could be another strength of the developing brain, this willingness to learn without the stigma.
I agree. I think we are making strides. I don't think it's gone completely, but I think
Mhm.
that we're making strides in that regard, and it is allowing people to share, and that might be a good part of social media, and that people are seeing like it's okay to talk about this, uh,
Mhm.
But the flip side is that social media can also offer negative um, cues like bullying, or making somebody feel isolated when they're seeing everybody else on Instagram having a great time when really
Mhm.
they're just showing their best 2 minutes. If if you're feeling vulnerable, you think that everybody's having a great time and here you are at home, and that can actually add to the anxiety and depression. So, again, how we use the internet can very much affect our mood.
Absolutely. Well, and that's an all ages problem. I mean, whether you're
Right.
15 or 50, if you're looking at Instagram and everyone is happy and glamorous, and you're
Mm.
stuck at home in your sweatpants, that's no fun at all.
No.
So I mean, is the thing to do to just say to kids, limit your time on TikTok or whatever it is that you like, or what, is there any safe or even positive way to consume that content?
Yeah. So I think that my grandmother used to say everything in moderation, right? And so a little bit of this, a little bit of that, that's all good. But when you become extreme and your world narrows down, you're clearly missing whole dimensions of what your life could be if you are sitting on in your room in a closed door, window shades down, playing video games for 14 hours of a day, right? I mean, your brain is during adolescence, your athletic skills are being developed by whatever sport you might try, or
Mhm.
musical instrument. Every single thing you do is helping shape and build your brain. If you only do one thing, you're depriving the other aspects of your functionality from developing. And I think that's why we all are saying a broad base, and yes, when you have a strength, you're going to spend a little bit more time there, but a broad base, because we need our brain to develop in sort of a balanced way, if you will, not skewed in just one direction. So, and I think people forget that adolescence is still a time of, very dynamic growth. In fact, the most important parts of your brain are frankly being, developed during the teenage years.
Mhm. And physical activity and fitness are an important part of brain development as well.
And learning. In fact,
Yeah.
it's been shown over and over again that physical exercise of any kind, you can go back and do a memory task, you're better at it. It changes your biochemistry in your brain, and you're able to do that connecting, creating more synapses much more easily.
I have a good question here. Somebody is asking about gender. How does gender impact brain development?
That's a great question. So we do know that men and women's brains are like 99.9%, the same. When men's brains are bigger because their bodies are bigger, so they weigh more. And there are some very minimal differences in some of the connections, but for the most part, they're quite similar. However, we do know that on average, boys' brains reach development about 2 years later for any stage than a girl's brain in this window. So,
Mhm.
some of you probably are smiling, thinking of the 13, 14, 15-year-old girls versus boys. And, I will say no more about the level of organization, the sort of the detail oriented versus forgetting things, and, planning issues and risk taking. So, it's about 2 years difference, but again, there are many early boys and many early girls, right? So we do know that this trajectory goes on until for both the brain cell connections inside these different areas I'm talking about, but also the connectivity. We call it myelination. It's myelin is kind of our own insulator, like for an electrical wire, because our brains are functioning on electricity, believe it or not. And so you need to insulate the long tracks that go from one side of the brain to another. When you want to act on something you see, that these different parts of your brain will talk to each other in milliseconds. And to make that fast happen, you have to insulate. And the myelination is little tiny cells wrapping around each of these long tracks. And there's miles of these tracks in your brain. And so the last place to fully connect is your frontal lobe, those tracks going to your frontal lobe. You have a frontal lobe, it's just not fully connected yet. So that's what takes longer, a little bit longer in boys than girls as well. So, again, it's on average, you don't want to overgeneralize, but that's what we see.
And what about children who are gender nonconforming? Are there brain development issues there as well, or differences, I should say?
So I think that is the $64 million question. And again, I think there are. This is a window again where, didn't I just say that you're forming your identity? Sexual identity, gender identity is part of that. And it is not a coincidence that this is when people are having these questioning themselves, decisions they're trying to make about what their identity is. And people who are transgender or, bisexual, hetero, homosexual, whatever, LGBTQ, this window where people are just discovering that they may fall into one of these, what we call categories, right? Whether that's even a real thing, is what neuroscience is going to have to figure out for us. And I think we're beginning to realize that we have the tools to those functional MRIs, for instance. We can look and see, does a transgender male to female visualize when they're shown a picture? Do they activate different parts of their brain? Or when they're asked to think about a certain subject than somebody who's female to male, or cis versus trans? We don't have those full answers yet. I've tried to look into this, and I'm going to be adding that into my next version of my book. It's just not ready yet. The science isn't ready to actually conclude much. It's still very early, but I do think we have the tools now to look at large populations to try to understand this. I think this will be extremely validating for people as they're going through this window and trying to understand when does this happen, and is there a neurobiological correlate? We don't have the answer yet, but believe me, I think a lot of people are very interested in this.
Yeah, I'm speaking of something a lot of people are interested in. Here in Philadelphia, well, in a lot of places, the other epidemic that we've been dealing with is gun violence. And we are seeing, especially among young men, that this is absolutely epidemic. As a neuroscientist, how do you see those burgeoning numbers? How do you sort through it?
Right. Well, I think that I've spoken at a number of juvenile justice kind of venues to judges and to people in that system. And I've been on a couple of amicus briefs to the Supreme Court about the law of the land, which had been life without parole for teenagers under 18 who commit a capital crime. And we were able to get the Supreme Court to roll that back and say it's on an individual basis, because the point that we are making is that this is not an adult brain, and holding teenagers to adult standards for how they are prosecuted for crimes is an issue. Now, having said that, why is it happening? Well, I've just told you that, especially males, who may be 2 years a little bit less mature than females at the age of 17, 18, but they're also very prone and vulnerable to peer pressure. And they may feel that their value is to join a gang, and they get a great deal of affirmation from that gang. It's the only place that really they feel like they get, this respect from, and they will, without reasoning through that this is not a good thing to do, and the consequence is I'm going to get arrested or somebody's going to die, there's going to be much more impulsivity, and also lack of ability to control emotional lability or rage, right? And if you have a gun in your hand, and you have issues with impulse control because of your developmental, where you are in your developmental spectrum, this is going to make you more vulnerable. And it is heartbreaking to see how, especially with stress, will bring on this, emotional turmoil in people. And if you really don't have the maturity yet to sort of modulate that, like maybe an adult would, we hope. So this is why I think we're, one of the reasons why we're seeing this epidemic happen. And, this is a community social problem. These people need alternative pathways for their energy. They need to be engaged in positive activities and youth groups and constructive, positive things. But if they don't have that because of their economics in their home or COVID, where everything was shut down, we're going to see them channel their energies without thought of consequence in a more extreme way. And it's, I think, our public leaders need to think about this, focus in on this group. I think it's going to take a concerted effort to offer alternative ways to reach out to these kids, to give them, to redirect them, if you will.
Yeah. It sounds like you've just really defined what is meant by treating gun violence as a public health crisis, because we do tend to think, oh, it's the individual doing the bad thing, and it's really a bigger deal than that.
Definitely.
Yeah. Here's it's a very much different course of a question, but it's one that popped up in my head too. Somebody is asking us, is it safe to give your teenager over-the-counter melatonin so that you get them to sleep earlier? Because you did tell us, doctor, that
I
their
told you about
bodies won't
melatonin.
produce the melatonin until later. So why not just give them a pill?
Okay, because you want them to create their own melatonin and not have their own melatonin be suppressed because it's being given as a pill and supplied for them from the outside of their body. So I think the best, we want to have them vigorously produce their own melatonin. And I think they can become dependent upon external melatonin. We don't want that. We want their brains to develop normally and for them to actually create their own melatonin. So it's much better. It's always better when you have a choice in something like that to try to rely on, your own endogenous source of a neurochemical. I think occasionally, jet lag, in rare occasions, it's probably totally reasonable to do when they've just been traveling and you want to bring them back into school and just like an adult, but I would not rely on it. I don't think enough's known. There isn't enough data as to the long-term consequences of giving melatonin nightly to a teenager. Every once in a while, fine. But I think it's, again, the story is not out. And so whenever the story is not out, I say, be cautious.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of giving pills to teenagers, there are a lot of pills we have been giving to teenagers for a long time.
Right.
I think about things like Adderall. And what do we know about the impact of these very commonly prescribed pharmaceuticals on developing brains? What has that impact been?
Yeah. So let me just answer that question with to tell you why it's different from drug addiction. Okay. And let's just tell you briefly, because people need to know this too, that, as I said, these brain cells can make connections faster and they learn faster. Well, it turns out that addiction is a form of learning. It's unfortunately, it's not like I'm trying to memorize a piano recital piece or a poem or math. I'm learning how to, I want it drug, right? And so repeated exposure of a fact or a practice causes good, strong connections. Repeated exposure of a drug causes very strong connections in a teenage brain in their addiction circuit, if you will, in their I want it circuit. So they can get addicted just like they can learn harder, stronger, longer, faster than an adult, they can get addicted harder, stronger, longer, faster than adult. Okay, to cocaine, to opioids, cannabis, nicotine, for
Nicotine,
sure.
yeah.
And that's been a big one. That's been a problem. And they create a hardwired circuit that's very difficult to undo if they ride out to adulthood. And you know this. I mean, they stay lifelong. They can stay lifelong addicted. And it's also not a great thing for brain development. We can talk about that if we have time. So we can also reverse that. Remember I said about psychiatric illness is the sooner you get to it. So if a teenager becomes addicted to an illegal substance, or even a legal substance, alcohol or cannabis, the time to intervene is now. And intervention centers used to be filled with, middle-aged alcoholic patients, and now they're filled with young people who have an opioid addiction, cannabis, or other, cocaine, for instance, addiction. And it's very effective to put people into an intervention early in this window, like late teens, early adulthood, to undo what has set in, but you have time to undo it for a few years until they reach sort of late 20s. And then their brain is sort of much more adult-like. So that's the story about illicit drugs.
Can I intervene? Just one quick question in there. I mean, do all illicit drugs or all addictive substances, let's put it that way, have that same impact, in the same parts of the brain? Because what I'm wondering about, I think a lot of parents might look the other way if a child is smoking or if they're having a beer, but everyone draws the line if they're getting after, grandma's oxy. Should you be...
So addiction can cross over between substances.
Okay.
Now, the occasional beer, a little bit of nicotine. I'm talking about chronic daily use of something where there's a clear dependence. That actually crosses over from one, it's easier to become addicted to the next thing if you're already addicted to one thing. Okay. So that's the case of like why they're vulnerable to drugs, drugs that alter your brain. Now let's just step back. And this usually, having just delivered that message, the usual response is, but I give my kid Ritalin and Adderall because they have ADD. What does that mean? And then I can say to you that that's a therapeutic. And the issue is if you have a child that has been diagnosed, legitimately diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or ADD alone and hyperactivity disorder by a physician, it has been shown if they fail to respond to sort of behavioral treatment that adding some of these amphetamine, adrenaline, drugs helps them focus their attention, and therefore they can learn what they're missing without the drug. And at the end of the day, the important thing is that they need to get educated at school. They need to learn things. And if they are not paying any attention, there is much greater harm of this person reaching adulthood without having learned anything or learned a lot less. So it is important and therapeutic to treat the person, but also to treat them so that they can use that time when they're really focused to learn by rote how to stay focused, develop checklists, to, really start being very organized. And generally, many people grow out of this because they've learned how to compensate. So I think that therapeutic use of some of these drugs is absolutely appropriate because it treats the long game, which is getting the person to learn what they need to learn for life skills. And generally they come off the drugs anyway, over time. So I think it's safe, but the important nuance to what I'm saying is that in some countries like England, for instance, pediatricians or, even social workers, pediatricians in this country can prescribe ADD drugs. In England, it has to be a psychiatrist, and they have to have had a full battery. So at the very least, I think you want to make sure that you've had a full ADD screen and that your child really has ADD, because sometimes the easy thing today to do is slap on, oh, it's ADD, when it actually is a decoding learning disorder that's subtle, that is appearing to look like they're not paying attention, but they're missing a skill set that they can be, as I said, they learn really well. This is a time to work on weaknesses, so that education would be the answer there. So getting the right diagnosis is really important there.
Yeah. And speaking of getting the right diagnosis, someone here is asking a very important question. How do I know if my child's mental health is declining? What are the warning signs I should look for?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't think I can fully answer that question because there's
Mm.
no one answer. I mean, it's all relative to who your child has been up until this point. And if you see dramatic changes in their behavior, I mean, the classic signs of depression are, weight loss, looking disheveled, social isolation, being withdrawn, no appetite, apathetic. These are obviously, and suicidal ideation, actually even, talking about
Yeah.
suicidality. These are the cardinal signs. Now, everybody's going to be different, but if your child is starting to show some of those things and it has happened in the context of what you think might make some sense to you, maybe it's COVID where they've been completely isolated, maybe you have a family history of somebody with depression. There are all these extra clues that say we need to look at this, a little bit more closely. The best person to talk about that with initially is probably your pediatrician, to
Yeah.
discuss, like, am I making this up or what do you think here? And then they'll put your child through a very easy battery to make sure that it's not one of these other things masquerading. But it is important to pay attention. And again, the other thing we said we'd say today was that you have to stay connected to your child. And if you develop a animosity or sort of a very charged relationship with your child where you've been mocking them or they've been arguing with you and you have this very negative interaction, they are not going to share with you. You won't be seeing these symptoms because they simply just won't hang around with you. I think it's really important that you kind of suppress your impulse yourself to like scream and pull your hair out when something is going on, but to take a step back. You're the adult in the room. Again, you have your frontal lobes. You have to stop. You have to count to 10 and you have to go, this is biology playing itself out. This is not good. And I need to stop it, but I have to figure out a different way of getting my message across and, influencing this child. And I think that's, a really important. Stay close, and then you'll be able to like have dinner with your child every night. This is already being vanishingly, even before COVID, it's been vanishingly, rare behavior now for people to actually, everybody's eating on the run and different times and people running up to their room to be on the internet. Spend some time. And it's also been shown for depression and in teenagers, especially, being out in nature, literally the natural setting, being at family events, having that close physical relationship with family members is really important in decreasing their risk for depression and anxiety in this time window.
Yeah. And I think about all the stress that parents are under as well. The economic, what's going to happen in the future. I'm worried about my mother. I'm worried about my kids. All this. Um, how can the wider community help support families who are, raising raising our future and could use a little bit of help themselves?
Well, I think a lot of what we've been saying is that it's not just the parents. You can't put all the burden on the parents. I mean, they're the closest at hand, but it's the neighbors, it's the community centers, it's everybody taking a slightly different view of what might be considered the unruly adolescent, or and just stopping for a minute, trying to understand them, engage them in constructive things, give them opportunities. Give them chores, give them things where they can succeed and feel proud of themselves. Praise them where they're appropriately to be praised. Be their ally. They're going through this for the first time. They're feeling emotions they've never had for the very first time while their hormones are changing. And, you're supposed to they're supposed to just handle this seamlessly. No, of course you need to, we have to be a little bit more empathetic and use the neuroscience. Knowledge is power. And I think in this case, it couldn't be truer.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we could sit here and talk for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much. I am really eager to hear about, where your research will take you next. Will you have a lot of COVID related things to look at?
I think we're looking at this incredible impact of social isolation on the teenage brain. I think this is, it's not my research; it's tons of different people's
The entire
research.
field, yeah.
The gender identity piece, more about drugs of abuse and what they do, and stress. More about how to, on the positive side, how to really enrich learning, and like, what do we know about that secret sauce that teenagers have? Can we have some too as adults? But how do we help support? How do we help support their learning and can track, like, to know, this is the window for this person, and really support them?
Great, great. And when's the next edition of your book coming out?
I would say another couple of years, because now
okay.
I'm going to start compiling some of this newer data. And again, it's very much right hot off the press in the academic journals, and that takes a long time to get to the public, and that's why I want to fast track it to everybody.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jensen, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. I hope we get to do this again soon.
I do too. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.